Elliot Hawthorne had built his empire on foresight, precision, and control. Those same instincts compelled him to quietly install concealed cameras throughout his expansive home, not out of fear for his fortune, but out of a deeper terror for his twin sons. He sat at the head of a glass conference table on the 42nd floor of a steel tower in downtown Manhattan. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out like a kingdom he'd conquered through precision, discipline, and relentless control. Across from him, 6 executives in tailored suits gestured toward quarterly projections glowing on a massive screen. Revenue streams, acquisition targets, expansion timelines. Elliot nodded at the appropriate moments. His posture remained perfect, his expression unreadable. But his mind had drifted far from this room, floating somewhere between the numbers on the screen and the silence waiting for him at home. For 6 months now, he had shown up to meetings like this one, spoken the language of profit margins and strategic pivots, and pretended that work still mattered the way it used to. Once, this boardroom had been his sanctuary, the one place where outcomes could be controlled, where effort equaled results. Now it was just noise, a place to hide from the house in the suburbs where his infant son sat in rooms he could no longer bear to enter. His phone vibrated against his chest. Elliot frowned. He'd disabled all notifications except one. His hand moved instinctively to his inner jacket pocket, intending to silence whatever had slipped through. But when his eyes caught the alert on the screen, his breath caught. Motion detected. Kitchen. Camera 3. He hesitated for only a second. Then, as if pulled by something deeper than thought, Elliot unlocked the screen. The image that filled the phone made the entire boardroom disappear. Noah and Caleb, his twin sons, were sitting on the kitchen floor. Their legs stretched out in front of them, motionless as always, dressed in matching gray onesies. But their faces were alive, glowing, radiant with something Elliot hadn't seen in half a year. Laughter. Real, full-bodied laughter that shook their tiny shoulders and scrunched their noses. In their small hands were wooden spoons, and in front of them sat 5 stainless steel pots arranged in a crooked line. Noah banged his spoon against the nearest pot with wild, uncoordinated joy. Caleb followed, striking a different rhythm, and together they created a chaotic symphony of metallic clangs that should have been noise, but sounded like music. Elliot stopped breathing. How long had it been since he'd heard that sound? 6 months. 6 months since the specialist told him the twins would never walk. 6 months since he'd begged God for a miracle and heard nothing but silence. 6 months since he stopped praying altogether. And then he saw her. Grace Holloway, the maid he'd hired 2 weeks ago after the 3rd nanny quit. She was lying flat on her stomach on the cold tile floor, still wearing her pale blue uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her hands, covered in yellow cleaning gloves, were pressed flat against the floor as she propped her chin on them, her face level with the boys. Every time Noah struck a pot, Grace clapped. When Caleb's spoon slipped and clattered to the floor, she gently placed it back in his hand, whispering something Elliot couldn't hear through the phone speaker. Then she began to hum, a melody so soft it barely registered, but it wrapped around the boys like a blanket. "That's it, Noah. You've got the rhythm now. And Caleb, you're the heart of this band." Her voice came through faint but unmistakable, warm, unhurried, completely free of pity. Elliot's hand trembled. The phone felt too heavy. Around him, someone was asking a question. The CFO was pointing at something on the screen. The room continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Because in that moment, Elliot Hawthorne, a man who had built an empire on control, who had installed hidden cameras in every corner of his home to ensure nothing ever went unwatched, realized that a stranger was doing what he, their own father, had been unable to do for 6 unbearable months. She was reaching them. A sharp, tangled emotion coiled in Elliot's chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't quite gratitude either. It was something darker and more painful, like seeing a part of himself he thought had died suddenly flicker back to life in someone else's hands. Elliot. The voice of his VP of operations cut through the fog. Elliot looked up, eyes hollow, realizing he had no idea what anyone had just said. He didn't care. I need to go home. Right now. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him in confusion. Elliot grabbed his coat and phone, ignored the murmured questions, and walked out without explanation or apology. Because every contract, every quarterly target, every carefully constructed pillar of his professional life had just become irrelevant. All he could think about was the kitchen in his silent suburban home, where his sons were laughing, where a woman in a blue uniform was lying on the floor beside them, and where a truth he'd been running from for 6 months was finally demanding to be faced. Before we go any further, take a moment to support this story. Subscribe now to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear about faith, hope, and the courage to sit on the floor with the ones you love. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to see how far this story has traveled. As the elevator doors closed behind him and Elliot descended toward the ground floor, his reflection stared back at him in the polished steel walls, a man in an expensive suit, hollow-eyed and exhausted. But while his body was moving forward, his mind was being dragged violently backward, pulled into the memory of the day everything shattered. The day the doctors walked into the hospital room and told him his sons would never walk. The day God stopped answering. The day Elliot Hawthorne stopped being a man of faith and became a man of cameras, control, and cold, crushing fear. The cameras had been installed 3 weeks after he brought the twins home from the hospital. Elliot told himself it was practical, necessary. The boys needed constant supervision. What if something happened while he was at work? What if a caregiver missed something critical? What if they fell, choked, stopped breathing? The company he hired was discreet, professional. 12 cameras positioned throughout the house, living room, nursery, kitchen, hallways, every angle covered, nothing left unwatched. Protection, he called it. But late at night, alone in his study with the lights off and a glass of whiskey growing warm in his hand, Elliot knew the truth. The cameras weren't there to keep his sons safe. They were there so he wouldn't have to hold them. Every evening after work, Elliot followed the same ritual. He would pour a drink, close the door to his study, and open the security app on his tablet. The screen would divide into a grid of 12 small windows, each one offering a different view of his home. And then, for hours, he would watch. He watched the twins sitting in their adaptive chairs in the living room, their legs strapped in place, their small bodies motionless. He watched the day nurse move through the house with efficient speed, checking vitals, changing diapers, administering medications. He watched the physical therapist guide Noah's legs through prescribed stretches while the boy stared at the ceiling, expressionless. Elliot rewound moments obsessively. A twitch of Caleb's finger. A slight shift in Noah's posture. He studied every frame, searching for signs of progress that never came. The recordings showed him everything except what he most wanted to see. His sons alive in the way they used to be. Before the accident, Noah had been learning to crawl. Caleb had been pulling himself up on furniture. They had squealed when Elliot came home from work, reaching for him with chubby hands. Now they sat, silent, still, waiting for a future that might never come. And Elliot watched from a distance, night after night, because watching felt safer than touching. If he kept them on a screen, He could control his emotions. He could observe without breaking. He could pretend he was being a good father by staying informed. But then Grace Holloway arrived. At first, Elliot barely noticed her. She was just another hire, the fourth in 3 months. The previous caregivers had all left for the same reason. The house was too quiet, too heavy, too sad. Elliot couldn't blame them. He felt it too. But Grace didn't leave. And slowly, through the cameras, Elliot began to see that something about her was different. She moved through the house differently than the others. Where the nurses rushed, Grace waited. Where the therapists followed protocols, Grace followed the boys. She didn't speak to them in the high-pitched, overly cheerful voice most caregivers used. She spoke to them the way you'd speak to anyone you respected, softly, directly, with patience. One evening, Elliot watched her sit cross-legged on the nursery floor beside Caleb's chair. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, waiting. After several minutes, Caleb turned his head slightly toward her. Grace smiled and began to hum. The melody was faint through the camera's audio, but Elliot recognized it immediately. A hymn, one his own mother used to sing when he was young. It is well with my soul. Elliot felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Not suspicion, not anger, something closer to conviction, like being caught. In a lie he'd been telling himself for months. He leaned closer to the screen. Grace wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to fix anything or force progress. She was simply present. Her hands rested in her lap. Her face was calm, peaceful, as though sitting in silence with a paralyzed infant was exactly where she wanted to be. Why does this feel like prayer? The thought arrived unbidden, and Elliot immediately pushed it away. He took a long drink and switched to a different camera feed. But over the following nights, he couldn't stop watching her. Grace never rushed the boys. When she fed them, she waited for them to swallow, to breathe, to rest. When she changed them, she narrated what she was doing in a gentle voice, as if their understanding mattered. When she played music, she didn't just turn on a playlist. She sat beside them and clapped softly, swayed gently, invited them into the rhythm. And sometimes, late at night, when she thought no one was watching, Grace would kneel beside their cribs, fold her hands, and bow her head. Elliot couldn't hear the words, but he knew what she was doing. She was praying. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. How long had it been since he'd prayed? Not the desperate, frantic bargaining he'd done in the hospital. God, please, I'll do anything. But real prayer. The kind he used to offer on Sunday mornings in the small church he and his late wife had attended. The kind that began with gratitude instead of panic. He used to pray over breakfast, over the twins when they were born, over business decisions and family plans and ordinary moments that felt sacred simply because they were shared. Now he sat in the dark, watching his sons through a screen, and the only thing he whispered into the silence was their names. Grace represented something Elliot had buried the day the doctors delivered their diagnosis, something he'd locked away along with his grief, his guilt, and his shattered expectations. Trust. She trusted that the boys could feel her presence even if they couldn't respond. She trusted that silence could be holy. She trusted that sitting on the floor mattered, even if it didn't lead to miracles. And somehow, in ways Elliot couldn't explain or control, that trust was reaching his sons in places his surveillance never could. One night, nearly 2 weeks after Grace started, Elliot was reviewing the day's footage when he saw it again. The twins on the kitchen floor, the pots arranged in a line, Grace lying beside them, clapping, laughing. But this time, Elliot didn't look away. He watched Grace lean close to Noah, her lips moving. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw Noah's face light up in response. Then she turned to Caleb and whispered something else, something that made the boy's entire body relax, his mouth curving into the smallest, most fragile smile. Elliot's hand froze on the tablet. Hope stirred in his chest, sharp, painful, terrifying, because hope meant risk. Hope meant believing something could change. And if he let himself hope and it didn't happen, the fall would destroy him. But he couldn't look away. Grace whispered again, and this time both boys laughed. Not a giggle, not a small sound, a real, full laugh that filled the kitchen and echoed through the camera's speaker. Elliot's vision blurred. He closed the tablet, grabbed his coat, and walked out of his study without turning off the lights. His hands shook as he unlocked his car. The drive home took 12 minutes, but it felt like hours. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Elliot sat in the car for a long moment, his heart pounding, unsure of what he would say or do when he walked inside. But for the first time in 6 months, he wasn't watching from a distance. He was coming home. Elliot stood in the doorway, between the hall and the kitchen, his hand still resting on the doorframe. His breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. The scene before him was more powerful than any screen could capture. Noah and Caleb sat on the kitchen floor in a pool of soft light from the overhead fixture, their legs stretched out, their faces glowing with an innocence that made Elliot's heart ache. The pots were arranged in front of them like an altar, and the twins held their wooden spoons like they were the most important instruments in the world. Grace was lying on her stomach beside them, her blue uniform wrinkled and dusty, one yellow-gloved hand keeping rhythm against the tile while the other rested gently on Caleb's back. She was humming something low and steady, a melody that felt older than the house itself. Then she saw him. Grace's body went rigid. Her humming stopped. She pushed herself up quickly, pulling off her gloves, her eyes wide with something close to panic. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in." Her voice trembled. She glanced at the pots, the spoons, the twins still sitting peacefully on the floor. Her hands twisted the gloves nervously. "I know I should have been cleaning. They seemed like they wanted to play, and I thought..." Elliot raised a hand and Grace went silent. He stepped into the kitchen slowly, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the tile. The authority he carried so naturally in boardrooms felt wrong here, too heavy, too sharp. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what his face was doing. He only knew that his throat was tight and his chest felt like it was caving in. "Why were you on the floor?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. Grace flinched, but didn't look away. "Because they were on the floor," she said quietly. "So I joined them." Elliot stared at her, waiting for more. Grace took a slow breath, her shoulders straightening slightly. "Children don't need people standing over them, Mr. Hawthorne. They need someone at eye level, someone who sees them, not their condition." She glanced at the twins, her expression softening. "They don't need pity. They need presence." The words hit Elliot like stones. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. Grace's gaze held steady, and for the first time since she'd started working in his home, Elliot saw something in her that unsettled him. Not defiance, not fear, certainty. "My grandmother used to tell me," Grace continued, her voice gentle but firm, "that God doesn't meet us when we're standing tall. He meets us when we lower ourselves, when we stop pretending we have it all together." She paused, her eyes searching his. Maybe that's true for people too. Elliot felt his jaw tighten. He looked away from her, his eyes landing on Noah, who was watching him curiously, spoon still in hand. "There's something you need to know," Elliot said finally, his voice flat. "I've been watching you." Grace frowned, confused. Elliot exhaled through his nose, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "There are cameras, hidden throughout the house, 12 of them. I've seen everything you've done since the day you started, every moment, every interaction. The color drained from Grace's face. You've been watching me. Her voice was barely a whisper, not angry, not accusatory, just hurt. A deep, quiet hurt that made Elliot feel like the smallest man in the world. Grace looked down at the twins, then back at Elliot. Her hands trembled as she set the gloves on the counter. I see, she said softly. She moved toward the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate. When she reached the doorway, she stopped, her back still turned to him. Love can't grow where it's watched, like a crime, Mr. Hawthorne. The words hung in the air like smoke. Elliot's heart lurched. Wait! Grace paused but didn't turn around. Elliot took a step forward, his voice cracking. Please, don't go. Grace turned slowly, her eyes red, but her expression composed. Why shouldn't I? Elliot's carefully constructed composure shattered. Because I'm terrified. The confession tore out of him like something that had been buried too long. His voice broke, and he didn't try to steady it. I'm terrified of loving them the way I should. I'm terrified that if I let myself get close, if I let myself hope, God will take them from me too. Just like he took their ability to walk. Just like he took every prayer I screamed into the void and gave me nothing back but silence. His hands shook. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. I don't trust God anymore. And I don't trust myself. So I put up cameras because watching felt safer than being present. Because if I kept them on a screen, I wouldn't have to face the fact that I've failed them every single day since the accident. Tears blurred his vision. He didn't wipe them away. I don't know how to be their father anymore, Grace. I don't know how to sit on the floor and pretend everything's okay when nothing is okay. I don't know how to love them without being afraid it's going to destroy me. The kitchen fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was Caleb tapping his spoon absently against a pot, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Grace walked toward Elliot slowly, her expression no longer guarded. When she stopped in front of him, she spoke in a voice so quiet it felt like a prayer. God didn't leave your sons, Mr. Hawthorne. She paused, letting the words settle. He's been waiting for you to come down to where they are. Elliot's chest heaved. He wanted to argue, to push back, to defend himself. But there was no defense left. No walls. No control. Just a broken man standing in his own kitchen, face to face with the truth he'd been running from. Grace held out her hand. Come with me. Elliot stared at her hand like it was a foreign object. His pride recoiled. His fear screamed at him to turn away. But his sons were on the floor, and Grace was offering him a bridge he didn't know how to build on his own. Slowly, shakily, he took her hand. Grace led him to the center of the kitchen, where the twins sat surrounded by pots and spoons. She knelt down first, then looked up at him expectantly. Elliot hesitated. The floor felt impossibly far away. His legs felt too stiff, his body too proud. But when Noah looked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes, something inside Elliot broke open. He lowered himself to his knees. Then he sat. His expensive suit crumpled. His polished shoes scraped the tile. And for the first time in 6 months, Elliot Hawthorne sat at eye level with his sons. Grace placed a wooden spoon in his hand. Just tap it, she whispered. Elliot stared at the spoon, his hand trembling. Then slowly, he reached forward and tapped the nearest pot. The sound rang out, sharp, clear, real. Caleb giggled. Noah clapped his hands together, clumsily, his face lighting up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. And Elliot, a man who hadn't prayed in half a year, closed his eyes and whispered into the sacred noise of his kitchen, God. I don't know if you're listening, but if you are, help me be here. Help me stay. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't confident. But it was the first prayer he'd offered that wasn't a demand. It was surrender. And in that moment, on the cold tile floor of his suburban kitchen, surrounded by pots and laughter, in the presence of a woman who believed God met people when they lowered themselves, Elliot Hawthorne finally came home. The cameras came down on a Saturday morning. Elliot stood on a stepladder in the nursery, unscrewing the small black device from the corner of the ceiling. It came loose with a soft click, and he held it in his palm for a moment. This thing that had promised safety, but delivered only distance. Grace stood in the doorway, holding Noah on her hip. The boy's head rested against her shoulder, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You don't have to do this all at once," she said gently. Elliot shook his head. "Yes, I do." He climbed down and placed the camera in a cardboard box with the others. 12 devices, 12 attempts to control what couldn't be controlled. He sealed the box with packing tape, carried it to the garage, and set it on a shelf where it would gather dust alongside other relics of the man he used to be. When he came back inside, Grace had laid Noah on a blanket in the living room beside Caleb. Both boys were awake, watching the morning light filter through the windows. Elliot knelt beside them. He didn't ask permission, didn't wait for the right moment. He simply lowered himself to the floor and lay down between his sons, one arm stretched toward each of them. Noah's small hand found his finger and gripped it. Caleb turned his head and smiled, and Elliot whispered, not to Grace, but to the God he'd stopped believing was listening, "I'm sorry for running, for hiding, for thinking I could love them from behind a screen." He paused, his throat tight. "Help me do this right. Not perfectly, just present." Grace didn't say anything. She simply sat in the chair nearby, hands folded in her lap, and let the moment unfold without interference. That afternoon, Elliot made 2 phone calls. The first was to a family therapist his assistant had recommended months ago, a number he'd saved but never dialed. The second was to his office, informing them he'd be taking a leave of absence. Not a few days, not a week, as long as it took. The healing didn't happen all at once. There were no miracles that first week, no sudden breakthroughs or divine interventions. The twins still couldn't walk. The doctors still offered cautious optimism, hedged with medical realism. The house still carried the weight of grief in its walls. But something shifted. Elliot began showing up for the twins' physical therapy sessions, not as an observer behind glass, but as a participant. He learned how to stretch their legs properly, how to support their bodies during exercises, how to read the subtle signs of discomfort or fatigue that he'd missed while watching from a distance. He sat on the floor during mealtimes, holding bottles, wiping chins, learning patience in the pauses between swallows. He read to them before bed, not from a script or a developmental checklist, but from books he remembered from his own childhood. Stories about brave knights and far-off kingdoms and adventures that ended not with perfect victories, but with characters learning they were stronger than they thought. And every night before he turned off the light, Elliot prayed. Not the desperate bargaining prayers of the hospital, not demands for healing or angry questions about fairness, just simple, quiet words. "Thank you for today. Help me. Be here tomorrow." Grace stayed. Not because Elliot asked her to, though he did, but because she saw something worth staying for. The man who had hired her out of desperation was slowly becoming the father his sons needed. She no longer worked under surveillance. She worked in partnership. When Elliot didn't know how to soothe Caleb during a difficult night, Grace showed him the gentle back rub that always helped. When Noah grew frustrated during therapy, Elliot learned from Grace how to redirect with humor instead of force. They developed a rhythm, not employer and employee, something closer to allies in a shared mission neither of them fully understood, but both were committed to. One evening, 3 weeks after the cameras came down, Elliot sat in his study, reviewing medical reports. Grace appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Elliot looked up. "Of course." Grace stepped inside, her hands clasped in front of her. "What changed?" "The day you came home. Early. What made you finally stop watching and start showing up?" Elliot set down the papers and leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. "I saw you lying on the floor with them," he said finally, "and I realized you weren't trying to fix them. You were just with them. Like that was enough." He met her eyes, and I realized I'd been so afraid of them not getting better that I forgot they were already here, already alive, already mine. His voice cracked. "I thought faith meant believing God would heal them. But maybe faith just means showing up even when you don't know what happens next." Grace smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "My grandmother used to say that God doesn't always change our circumstances. Sometimes he just changes where we're standing when we face them." Elliot nodded slowly. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that." The progress was slow, but it was real. The twins began sleeping through the night more often. They smiled more easily. During therapy sessions, the physical therapist noted increased engagement, better muscle tone, small improvements that might mean something or might mean nothing, but that felt like gifts either way. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic. There was no guarantee the boys would ever walk, no timeline, no promise. And for the first time in his life, Elliot learned to live without guarantees. He learned that love didn't require certainty, that faith wasn't about controlling outcomes, that being a father meant showing up on the hard days and the hopeless days and the days when nothing changed, and choosing presence anyway. Grace never preached, never quoted scripture or offered platitudes. She simply lived what she believed, that God was in the showing up, in the sitting down, in the holy work of being present even when presence felt like all you had to give. And somehow, that was enough. On a warm Saturday in early spring, Elliot carried the twins into the backyard. Grace followed with a blanket, spreading it across the grass beneath the old oak tree. The sun filtered through new leaves, casting soft shadows that danced in the breeze. Elliot set Noah and Caleb on the blanket, then lowered himself beside them. Grace sat cross-legged on the other side, her face turned toward the light. For a while, no one spoke. The twins reached for blades of grass, felt the texture of the blanket beneath them, listened to birds calling from the branches above. Then Caleb laughed, sudden and bright, and Noah joined him, and the sound filled the yard like music. Elliot closed his eyes and let the laughter wash over him. They didn't walk yet, but we did. The thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, settling into his chest like truth often does. Not dramatic, not loud, just true. His sons hadn't taken physical steps, but the family had moved, from fear to presence, from surveillance to trust, from a house that held its breath, to a home that finally knew how to exhale. Elliot opened his eyes and looked at Grace. She was watching the twins with that same peaceful expression she always wore, like she'd known all along that this moment was coming. "Thank you," Elliot said softly. Grace shook her head. "You did the work, Mr. Hawthorne." "Elliot. Call me Elliot." She smiled. "Elliot." The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's wind chime sang. And in that ordinary sacred moment, Elliot Hawthorne finally understood what Grace had been trying to teach him from the beginning. God had never left. He'd been waiting on the floor the entire time, waiting for a father to stop watching from a distance and come down to where love actually lived. You can't protect what you refuse to love openly. God often heals families not by changing bodies, but by restoring presence. The floor is where pride ends and grace begins. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. and leave a comment below telling us what spoke to you most. Because sometimes the miracle isn't in the healing, it's in the showing up.